Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to all the panelists. Welcome to all our attendees. Great to see so many. Okay. We're probably going to want to go, I'm going to unshare if that's okay, Ashley.
Sure.
I'm going to stop sharing your screen. And we'll begin in about 2 minutes. I've been having issues with the Q&A, so we have not disabled the chat. So please feel free to post any questions, any relevant questions you may have in the chat. What I'm planning on doing is that we will go through the presentations, and then at the end, we can answer any questions that any of the attendees or any of the other panelists might have. Okay, great. I'm just going to welcome everybody to the Pathways and Support panel. We still have about a minute. Attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them. And our first presenters will be Professor Stephen Case, Dr. Charlie Sutton, and I believe you have another contributor as well.
Hi, yeah, Mark Monaghan's also joining us.
Will he be logging in as well?
Yes, he will be.
Perfect. Would you like another set of panelists to go in first?
No, that's fine. I'm ready to go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm Charlie Sutton. I'm here to speak with you about our study, which is understanding criminogenic influences on youth offending. I will be presenting, and my colleagues, Professor Stephen Case and Dr. Mark Monaghan, will be taking questions. So just really to give you an overview of what our project is about, we're using realist synthesis to review research on youth crime interventions in England and Wales for children aged 10 to 17. It's an iterative approach in terms of reviewing and evaluating research. And it's driven by theory. It's often used as an alternative or in addition to a Cochrane-style review. The benefits are seen to be that it provides details of context, not only describing what works, but also what works, for whom, under what circumstances, how and why. In addition to our main realist synthesis review, we'll also be conducting a review of effectiveness reviews of youth justice interventions in England and Wales. And that will feed in to our main project and inform its direction. It is, the realist synthesis approach is scientifically validated and based on Ramsey's principles. Our team is interdisciplinary. Steve Case is an expert on youth crime from Loughborough University. And we have realist expertise from colleagues at the University of Leeds and the University of Birmingham, which Mark Monaghan is from. We are funded by the Nuffield Foundation over 3 years, and we've just come to the end of our first year. So in terms of some sort of policy context, the youth justice system in England and Wales really changed quite dramatically following the 1998 Crime and Disorder Act. This followed an era really where there was dissatisfaction with what was seen to be an ineffective and inefficient system, where nothing worked in terms of intervention. And so the 1998 Act brought in a very system-focused response to youth justice. And this included holding children responsible for their offending, and also managing not only the child and their negotiation of the system, but also managing the system. So children were assessed, interventions were prescribed, and these results of interventions were measured. And risk factors formed heavily within this approach, and the What Works reviews of intervention effectiveness worked very well with this, because they were both seen to measure. The two often sort of went hand in hand. However, things started to change, and there was a move from a risk-based approach towards what seemed to be an increasingly child-focused approach, largely due to the narrow view of causation that was coming out of the use of risk factors and the What Works evaluations. Diversion became something that is mentioned within the literature as an alternative option for children, rather than putting them through the system, and treating children as children first and offenders second also started to develop during this period. And more recently, trauma-informed practice has become quite a significant part of the way in which youth justice is seen and delivered within England and Wales. So it was slow, the move away from risk. It's still very evident within elements of our youth justice system. And there is frustration because this tends to lead to an individualised view, individualised explanations of crime. There is a lack of mechanisms of change within the understanding and within some of the approaches, and also a lack of context in terms of the explanations of crime. So this leaves us with an explanatory black box. So our decision to use realist synthesis has been influenced by this, and in particular the interaction, the focus on interaction between context, mechanism and outcome is seen to be of a real benefit in terms of giving us that detail understanding. So rather than looking at causation as a sort of linear statistical correlation-based explanation, we look at causation as generated by mechanisms. The activities that we have completed within our first year are mapping and reviewing in detail the youth justice policy for England and Wales in the period mentioned. And we've also compared and drawn parallels with criminological theory by completing a review of that alongside this. We've built on this through expert interviews with practitioners and policymakers who were involved at the beginning of the period 1996 onwards, and people who are practitioners and policymakers at the moment. And this has informed our literature searches. So we complete searches and have been completing preliminary searches throughout the project, and this information has informed our search terms and informed the direction of our searches. So in terms of using the realist inquiry, in particular, we are interested in being able to explain not only successes, but also using the fact that the relationship between context, mechanism and outcome is explored in detail. So that we can also understand what fails and who it fails for. So we're looking at the detail. Our findings to date, again, preliminary searches, but we have identified that the multi-agency youth offending teams are primarily responsible for delivering interventions in the youth justice system. So that is our focus. And we have also found that there are two dominant programme theories underlying YOT's decision making and delivery of the interventions, and these are risk, needs, responsivity, which is very evident in the policy literature in the late 90s, and was also very prevalent in searches and in expert interviews. Relationship-based approaches weren't so evident in searches, but certainly became evident in policy from 2011 up until the present time, and were very evident in our expert interviews. So in terms of our next steps, we will use our literature searches to look at families of interventions that sit under these approaches to understand how they are received in terms of things like their delivery, in terms of their fit for children, and in terms of children's engagement. If anybody has any queries following this, please send them to me. This is my email, c.e.sutton2@loughborough.ac.uk. And as I said earlier, I'll hand over to Stephen Case and Mark Monaghan for questions. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much. So my thoughts are, if any of the attendees or any of the panelists have any questions, I mean, panelists can certainly unmute and ask the questions directly. And then if y'all don't mind, we will answer questions once all the panelists have gone, so I can make sure that we have enough time that each panelist can present. Just keep in mind, Dr. Sutton, that you already have one question in the chat, and we'll get to that as soon as we're all done. Thank you so much for awesome presentation.
Thank you, my pleasure.
We're so lucky to have all of you present here, and a great pool of attendees. So Ashley, would you like to go next?
Absolutely.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure, share the presentation here. Oops. Okay. Great. Well, thank you. I'm Ashley Bauman. I'm president of Bauman Consulting Group, which is a public and social sector consulting firm. And I'm also the author of Pathways to Change, Individual Casework Interventions for Criminal Justice Involved Women. With me is Tira Hubbard. She's the program manager for Jackson County Community Justice in Medford, Oregon. And we're going to share with you a little bit about the Pathways to Change model and the impact that we're seeing it have on justice-involved women across the state of Oregon, as well as the many other stakeholders in the state of Oregon. So let's start by first just kind of talking about the idea of Pathways to Change. So it came from the concept of core correctional practices, or CCP. And there's an extensive body of research that demonstrates CCP's effectiveness in reducing recidivism. However, when looking at this research, very few of those studies examined whether the principles apply to women specifically, and most samples that incorporate women only have about 5 to 15% of their samples including women. Skills that are taught in those traditional interventions, which are grounded in CCP, may not focus on issues that women specifically face, or they might need to be readjusted to reflect women's experiences. So what we know is that women may face issues related to their children, like high levels of parental stress, domestic violence, relationship dysfunction, emotional regulation concerns, or coping skills that they lack. Emotions and those somatic experiences can take on a greater role in women's recovery. So this may be important for staff to know skills related to brain-body regulation or communication, techniques like mindfulness or stress reduction. There may also be a need to integrate relational and boundary issues. Women need help identifying relationships that are troublesome to their success. They might need assistance overcoming guilt related to losing their children, or identifying how to reintegrate their children into their lives, or even how to trust others. They also need to examine ways of how not to violate boundaries with others and how not to let others violate their boundaries. Additionally, experiences with trauma can complicate the traditional use of authority and boundary issues. A lot of the experiences women have are a kind of a universal experience with trauma, and that can also impact the delivery of sanctions and incentives. And ultimately, core correctional practices tend to traditionally lack an emphasis on client strengths. So gender responsive core correctional practices have been developing over the years. The early research on these specifically related to the women offender case management model have demonstrated reductions in risk factors, increases in protective or resiliency factors, reduced recidivism, which has included fewer technical violations and new arrests, and also has been demonstrating support for the risk principle. So that led us to the development of Pathways to Change, which incorporates the principles of effective intervention, relies on a core correctional practice model, while also integrating gender responsiveness and trauma-informed approaches. So it's designed specifically for justice-involved women, and our preliminary research on this is demonstrating several positive outcomes. So let me first explain what Pathways to Change is. It's a structured case management model centered around what we call the 4 R's, which are relating, reporting, regrouping, and reinforcing. And the core materials are made up of a collection of 52 total worksheets, 22 core, 15 specialty, and 17 skills. Our core worksheets are designed to apply to any risk or need in the woman's life, and they allow for a great deal of flexibility when administering them because they can be used in many different ways. An example of this is one of our strengths worksheets called What's in Your Pack, which is designed to identify interpersonal strengths or internal strengths rather that the women possess, which can help them be successful in the community. The specialty worksheets have more special applications to them. An example of these, for example, is the relationship worksheet, where clients have the ability to examine interpersonal relationships in their lives and identify ways that they can proceed accordingly. We also have skills worksheets. There are 17 of these that address a wide range of skill deficits that a woman may experience in her life. One example here are criminal justice success skills. These are the skills that women will need to successfully navigate criminal justice involvement. And the worksheets all work in tandem as a way to uniquely apply to each woman. So we can kind of pick and choose and customize an approach for each individual woman as she goes through the process.
So In the state of Oregon, we adopted the Women's Risk Need Assessment, WRNA, about 5 years ago. Following that, we worked with Bauman Consulting to adopt pathways. First in our institution and then in community corrections. For continuity of care, we wanted justice-involved women to have access to pathways both while in the institution as well as in the community. In Jackson County, we started pathways implementation through focused office visits on 2 gender-responsive caseloads that included 110 women. Prior to pathways, we were already case planning with women during our office visits, but found that when we got to goal setting and cognitive behavioral interventions, the gender-neutral CBIs available did not address the needs identified in the WRNA. Once we adopted pathways, we printed them all and created individual folders for each woman. Although they don't have to be used that way, we wanted something visual and tangible to make it more appealing for the women. Pathways are colorful and based on this visual theme of hiking a path out of the system. The women really relate to it and have expressed that Pathways worksheets feel relevant to their actual risks and needs. We've had such success, we've added another full-time and 2 part-time gender-responsive POs to make sure all of our women get these resources. Part of that is utilizing positive reinforcements, and we've incorporated Pathways into that model. When women complete a Pathways worksheet or make progress on their goals, we celebrate. We've worked with local partners to get donated items to give out in a monthly celebration drawing. One local group got their scrapbookers together and created weekly planners for our clients. We added many of the Pathways into the planner so that women could have easy access to the worksheets to use on their own. The photo here is an example of one of our donated reward baskets. Local partners such as Junior League, Seroptimus, churches, and employers have donated reward baskets as well as women's hygiene supplies. Positive reinforcements are so effective, we've applied them to staff as well. We started by tracking staff's use of positive reinforcements with clients and then rewarding staff with things like candy bars, public praise, and healthy competition to keep that positive reinforcement motivation going. One of the funding streams that allowed the state of Oregon to adopt both the WRNA and Pathways was through a legislative pilot project designed to reduce prison and foster care usage for justice-involved parents. Jackson County was one of 5 counties in our state selected for the Family Sentencing Alternative Pilot Project, FSAP. 3-year results from FSAP, which included the use of Pathways, has reported a 17.2% recidivism reduction. We are early in the pilot, but are noting that it becomes more effective over time. Sampled in these photos are 2 of our successes in the program. The woman on the left was headed for prison and was diverted into FSAP, and the woman on the right was able to attend her brother's police academy graduation after they reunified as part of her success. So going beyond the criminal justice system, in addition to decreasing revocations to prison and reducing recidivism, we've also had success in keeping kiddos out of the foster care system and in the care of their mamas. For our incarcerated parents that were not selected for FSAP, the average length of foster care days was over 1,000. FSAP parents averaged about 674 days. Although still slightly larger than our statewide average, a noticeable decrease from the incarcerated peers. Pathways has played an integral part in helping our women with their coping and parenting skills, allowing them to keep their kiddos in their care. So thank you for attending this portion. If you have any follow-up questions or want to learn more about how to get ideas or how to implement Pathways in your community, please contact Ashley at Bauman Consulting Group. And the email's on the slide there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is great. And now I don't want to, what's your name? Elias?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, awesome. Great. Take it away.
All right, let me just pull up my slides here. And there we go. Okay, so I'm Elias Nader. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Baltimore, and my presentation today will be on turning points for young and emerging adults. I want to acknowledge some funders of this research, the Association for Doctoral Programs in Criminology and Criminal Justice, and the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Very briefly, I'm just going to touch base on the theoretical framing for this work, which is grounded in the life course perspective and specifically the age crime curve and how turning points function within that. So the age crime curve tells us that crime and risky behaviors tend to peak in the mid to late teens, and that turning points facilitate a transition out of these behaviors and into more pro-social behaviors. And traditionally, they're conceptualized to be things like marriage, parenthood, employment, home ownership, and military service. Emerging adulthood is a life phase that has essentially demonstrated a shift in how this age crime curve works. So there are delays in terms of when turning points can be reached, which may influence how long young people engage in crime or risky behaviors. And these changes include things like structural changes in society, such as the economy or the emphasis on higher education, and demographic shifts like the increases in age for marriage, parenting, and home ownership. So the goal of this study is to assess how turning points into adulthood work for justice-involved young adults. And I conducted in-depth qualitative interviews with 30 young people. And in my analysis of these, I tried to focus on building on themes in existing research, as well as being open to emergent themes in the data. I'm happy to talk more about this if anybody has any questions, but for the sake of time, I'm just gonna try to keep the coding process brief. Here's some very basic information about the sample that I conducted, or that the sample that I collected. On average, they're about 22 and a half years old, and a little over half of them have histories of justice involvement, which helped me to kind of compare between the justice involved and non-justice involved groups. A little over half were identifying as male, and about 40% of the sample identified as white, about 10% as Black or African American, and about 30% as Latinx or Hispanic. So I want to highlight some of the key turning points that came out of the coding of these interviews. And the first of these are different types of relationships, and changes in or building of these relationships functioned as turning points into how these young people saw themselves as adults, particularly changes in family and connection to family. Young people expressed that they wanted independence from their parents financially and still wanted to keep these relationships strong. So there was an emphasis on shifting towards emotional attachment as opposed to a physical or structural dependence on parents. The second realm of relationships was peers. And here, young people emphasize that they wanted to cut ties with peers who they saw as being bad influences or poor friends, and instead shifted their focus on trying to build or keep relationships with peers with an emphasis on those they can trust and those that will support them through their transition into adulthood, and for the justice-involved portion, transitions out of crime. Something that was interesting was romantic relationships were not as important for justice-involved emerging adults as they were for their non-justice-involved peers. And this is not necessarily surprising because we know in the concept of traditional turning points that justice-involved emerging adults, or that justice-involved young people reach turning points at delays compared to their non-justice-involved peers. So it's not surprising that the justice-involved emerging adults in this sample were behind, in a sense, in romance as well. Finally, in the context of relationships, being a parent for those who were parents served as the most important of these kind of relational turning points. When young people became parents, it kind of superseded all other relationships that they had, including romantic relationships or relationships with the partner with whom they became a parent. The next realm of turning points that were important in this sample was employment. And there were some pretty important shifts in terms of what employment looks like and what young people look for in employment compared to previous generations. Specifically, they emphasize establishing a quality career and one that can give them fulfillment and happiness as being a marker of achieving adulthood. So simply getting a job is not enough to serve as that turning point for young and emerging adults. They also recognize that this achieving this marker of quality work, of fulfilling work is not easy. And they recognize that they're willing to put in the effort to engage in training or education. And I have a short quote here from one of the participants, Carlos, who acknowledges or talks about his interest in becoming an EMT. And he says, I know that they don't make money like that, but it's something exciting and something that he wants to do because he loves it. So it's emphasizing kind of this focus on fulfillment, happiness, interest being the importance of employment. The third kind of overarching realm of turning points that I identified from this analysis was financial independence and stability. This was very important in the context of embracing adult identity. And previously, this may have looked like owning a home. And now with demographic shifts in society, young people are not as focused on owning a home immediately, or at least within this life phase of emerging adulthood. So in their kind of late teens and early to mid 20s. Instead, they're focused on just trying to get out of a living situation with family. So whether that's renting with roommates or renting alone. Additionally, they emphasize just wanting to be able to pay their bills and save some money for the future and not have to worry about what their financial status looks like. They see that being able to establish this type of financial stability as a marker in terms of their achievement of adulthood status. And finally, they emphasize wanting to be able to afford what they call luxuries, like having a car, owning a TV, or being able to buy something that they want. The last kind of realm of these turning points is maturity over one's younger self, and specifically taking responsibility for their actions. This was something particularly interesting to see come out of these interviews because young people identify this cognitive realization process as an important marker of them achieving adulthood. So when they're able to recognize that they have achieved growth and achieved maturity over their younger selves, they see this as being an important part of their transition into adulthood. And particularly, this plays an important role for those that are not able to achieve other turning points on the way to adulthood. I have a quote here from Sebastian that highlights how, when reflecting back on how he was at 22, he thought he was mature. He felt like he had it, as he says, and he distances himself from this behavior and says, that's the type of thing that I used to do. And he goes on to recognize that now, being 24, a couple of years older, he has matured even more since that part. So it's important to understand that they recognize that this maturity is kind of a process, as opposed to just being a switch that they can kind of turn on or a line that they cross into adulthood. Very briefly, I want to highlight a couple of implications of this research. And the first of these being the importance of community-based interventions, which is not something new. It has been discussed in the research on criminology that these community-based interventions can support young people in their late teens, early to mid-20s that kind of fall into this gap of service in the justice system. But community-based interventions offer an opportunity for supporting these young people in achieving turning points and overcoming barriers of system involvement. And they do this through things like employment training, offering educational services, helping young people get their GEDs, introducing them to new social skills, and helping them, introducing them to new social groups and helping them develop new life skills. So it's important to understand that these turning points should be considered in policy or practice around these community-based interventions. And then finally, I just want to emphasize or re-emphasize the importance of maturation in the context of turning points. A lot of research on emerging adults has examined what these turning points look like and what these shifts look like, but the findings from this study suggest that measuring maturation in the context of turning points is important. This context kind of needs to be in there, and this work has certainly begun to be done and is becoming more popular. Just want to re-emphasize the importance of that, in that turning points can't be considered outside of the context of individual maturity. Thank you. I have my contact information listed here. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me or reach out over Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I am going to turn. Thank you so much. Dr. Jordana Navarro and I are next. I will share my screen. And Jordana, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jordana Navarro. I'm currently a black box because I'm dealing with pandemic life like all of us. And so you'll excuse my black box as I have a homeschool child behind me. I will go over the literature review, but Joan and I will be jumping in with each other to discuss our study. Next slide, please.
I'm terrible at this.
That's okay. So our study is about looking at the impact of community disorder on children and the impact of children with the parenting styles that are also influenced by community disorder. So instead of just looking at disorder and crime, we wanted to take a deeper look and look at how disorder influences the parents who then influence the children, recognizing that none of these components exist in silos. We also wanted to look at gender differences in antisocial behavior because we know through prior research that parenting does differ for boy children and girl children. And there are different styles employed in the managing of their behavior. So we wanted to take a gendered perspective in looking at antisocial behavior. Next slide, please. And then most importantly, before we skip over, we want to identify factors that might minimize youth engagement in antisocial behavior, because we know obviously engagement in antisocial behavior left unchecked and on that pathway leads to nowhere good for the family involved or definitely for the child involved. And so the slide that she's on, so social disorganization obviously has a long history in criminology with sometimes conflicting studies. One of the most notable studies that guided the results that Joan is going to present is Sampson and Rodenberg, which looked at 4 factors. So the first one is concentrated disadvantage. So concentrated disadvantage is really the financial insecurity of that neighborhood, the various sources of adversity that those individuals living within that neighborhood are encountering, such as, again, lack of viable employment opportunity, lack of viable educational opportunities to break out of their financial insecurity. The next factor looked at is residential stability. And so social disorganization looks at basically communities. One of the largest factors that I'm going to discuss here in a second is collective efficacy, where a community can get together and kind of become resilient to any of the crimes that come about. And so one of the ways that happens is for the residents of an area to build strong bonds with each other. And so the idea behind residential stability is if people are constantly moving in and out of an area and not getting to know their neighbors, that those bonds, those abilities to forge those connections that are so important for being resilient against crime are less likely to forge.
Do you want me to talk about immigrant concentration?
Sure, jump in.
So immigrant concentration results have been mixed, whereby in some instances, immigrant concentration tends to enhance conduct problems. But in all honesty, most of the research that I have conducted has found that immigrant concentration actually tends to have a protective benefit for antisocial behavior, violent behavior, exposure to violence, and victimization. And several processes are involved there. Immigrants in highly concentrated immigrant communities are much more likely to be married. They're much more likely to have familial social support. And they're much more likely to engage in protective parenting factors that can impact whether or not children are likely to interact with deviant peers, engage in unstructured socializing, and engage in other behaviors conducive to criminogenic environments. And much of my research has supported that, the fact that neighborhoods with higher concentration of immigrants, foreign-born residents, actually experience lower levels of individual youth engagement in violence. And then, we have collective efficacy, and I'll take that for you, Jordana. Oftentimes we see a lot of the research pitting collective efficacy against social disorder. And one of the, I guess, disingenuous, I will be as bold as to say that, is that we expect collective efficacy to be a macro level concept, and yet we construct it from micro level individuals, and we basically aggregate it to the macro level. And depending on residents' responses, some people are just more prone to being active and willing to enact social control, willing to engage with their neighbors. And so if you do have a particular group, a particular cluster of individuals that are highly motivated, then the macro level measure of collective efficacy is going to be higher. Now, going the same way, if you have a neighborhood that is particularly disordered, where social comorbidities, social problems, then at the individual levels, enacting informal social control, activating social control, can lead to problems at the individual level for these residents. And so they're less likely to want to, and I always think about the adage that my students taught me a couple of semesters ago: snitches get stitches. And we have to, as a discipline, really have to stop using individual measures and then averaging them out and aggregating to the community level, because what we're doing then is enforcing a mean level and then not really evaluating individual responses and individual desire or ability to actually enact social control. And so, sorry, Jordana, take it away.
No, thank you. I mean, that's the point. Again, we're going to just tag team each other because we both worked on this. Primarily Joan, but.
True.
So just one bullet slide that's not there, but so this all goes without saying that parents are the primary agent of socialization, and there's a lot of obviously theories that we're all familiar with in this session that are built on the role of parenting. Most importantly, the general theory of crime, but also even our environmental theories like routine activities theory recognizes the role of the capable guardian. So parents are a crucial role in the behavior of their children, especially early, before the role of peers gains greater importance. And we know from prior research that ineffective or abusive parenting practices, that does aggravate antisocial outcomes in children, increased aggression in the school. A lot of my work is actually in cyberbullying or bullying in general. So we know things like exposure to domestic violence, or witnessing domestic violence, that children often mirror that behavior in school, increased involvement in crime for themselves, again, low self-control, that parents that don't instill a barrier for their children when they're young, they are more likely to engage in antisocial behaviors.
Right.
So inversely, then
So I'm
warm and
gonna-
supportive parenting. Go ahead, Joan.
Sorry, love. We have a minute and a half.
Okay. Oh,
So
go ahead, Joan.
I'm just
speed
going to
up.
go straight to the data
Yes.
and methods. I mean, with a little reference of the matrix, because, you know, Keanu, just saying. So Jordana's going to kill me later, but later. Anyway, we use the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. You can link to it, ICPSR. It is a restricted data set, but fairly simple to acquire. We do multi-level split regressions so that we can compare girls to boys in terms of the coefficients, which we haven't actually done for this presentation because there's just a lot of data. I thought we'd first look at neighborhood effects on antisocial behavior, looking at the traditional structural characteristics of poverty, immigrant concentration, stability, and disorder. And of these metrics, in a means as outcomes regression, immigrant concentration had a protective effect on youth antisocial behavior, and stability had a protective effect on youth antisocial behavior for both boys and girls. Okay, so for both boys and girls, which was pretty cool. In terms of family management and family practices, family conflict, so measuring the amount of conflict in the family or assessing the amount of conflict for neither boys and girls didn't make a difference. Supervision made no difference. Restrictiveness, basically whether or not these kids were allowed to hang out in the neighborhood unsupervised. Again, oh, this one, yes. So this one had a protective effect for girls and boys. And I have all the beta coefficients if that tickles your fancy, or the ERR's event rate ratios if that tickles your fancy. Social support, no, sadly enough, no effect. Divorce, whether or not parents experienced a divorce during the data collection period, had a risk or a criminogenic effect enhancing antisocial behavior, but just for boys. Girls were like, yeah, whatever. But for boys, it tended to have a much greater effect. And then harsh discipline. So harsh disciplining practices, no effect. And then peer relationships, I will go through them. Deviant peers, highly predictive of antisocial behavior for both girls and boys. Unstructured socializing, girls and boys. Peer social support, interestingly enough, for girls tended to act as a risk factor, controlling for all the other family factors that we have already discussed. So we're building up the model. And then finally, last one, because I want to go faster, cohort membership, meaning that the older youth tended to engage in more antisocial practices. For boys, African-American boys compared to white boys tended to have higher levels of antisocial behavior. Socioeconomic status had no effect. And then Hispanic, compared to white boys, Hispanic boys experienced higher levels of antisocial behavior. What can we conclude? That's a good question. Basically, the idea that we really need to take a look at disaggregating data for girls and boys, because the pathways to antisocial behavior differ, in particular, the role of neighborhoods and how these cross-level interactions operate. And I just want to say thank you, because we all need a little bit more Moira in our lives. Okay, thank you. I guess we'll open it up to questions. Questions, comments? Thank you, Dr. Beaupre. Yes, Jacqueline, I can. I mean, we don't actually, I don't control for whether or not the kids were justice involved, although it is an option with the self-report of offending. One of the things that we're looking at next is to also look at immigrant status of these individuals. One of the constraints with the PHDCN, which is a really interesting one and one that we should focus on, is the fact that Hispanics tend to be grouped into one large category. And when we think about antisocial behavior or any behaviors that are deemed criminogenic, and then think about, you know, involvement and acculturation or assimilation, grouping, you know, culturally all these different ethnicities and potentially nationalities can be problematic. So in terms of whether or not we can actually control for whether or not these kids were arrested, I'm not quite sure if we have any information on whether or not they've been detained, but I'll take a look. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Moira memes?
Okay, I see it. One for me. Let me just read it real quick. So so Bianca, I'm looking at your question right now. For this, the young people really look at these roles as a process and are less, they recognize the acquisition of these roles, but for them, especially those kind of being in this 18 to 25 range, don't feel like the acquisition is quite within reach. And there are exceptions to this, right? I had people in my sample who were married or had kids or had employment that they felt like they had achieved, you know, in their career field, but overall they kind of, the people who had achieved some of these roles had gotten part of it, but had not felt like they had achieved that adult status yet. So it's kind of like very difficult, I think, to parse out all the different portions of this. But I would say based on my sample, the event is not necessarily as important as the process getting to that event and what that process looks like in their own meaning making of adulthood. Bianca, did that answer your question? If not, feel free to, okay.
Yeah, Elias, I think that's great. I think that that interaction between thinking about the event versus identity is really fascinating and interesting. And so it's just kind of that interplay, right? I think theoretically we focused a ton on the event, right? And assumed that it's sort of like this turning point and this acquisition of role status, where it seems like the work with emerging adults and contemporary samples is much more picking up on this identification or this identifying as an adult and sort of that process of getting towards it. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And then let me take a look at Matthew's question here. Yes. So Matthew's question is asking about romantic relationships and within the emerging adulthood literature in general. They have characterized, conceptualized romantic relationships in emerging adulthood as an opportunity to explore with a little bit more depth than adolescence. So people feel like they're trying things out, but looking for more serious qualities in romantic partners. And that's definitely where my non-justice involved sample was. For those that were justice involved, they often just were trying to get a different baseline established in terms of their relationships. So because of the barriers of justice involvement, they have different issues in terms of what their peer structures look like, what their familial structures look like, and general social support. So they saw kind of establishing a serious romantic relationship as not necessarily being a priority because they were working on those other types of relationships and supports instead. They definitely engaged in dating. Many of them had partners with which they had children. But even for the ones that had like, a partner that they had been with for a while, they had not identified that specific relationship as being important to how they viewed themselves as an adult or viewed their transition into adulthood or desistance. Thank you for the questions.
Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank all the attendees for coming. I'm not going to speak for all of the other panelists, but I don't think I've ever had this many people at a conference presentation. So I'm like, yeah, I wonder if I can put that in my CV, like, hey, guess what? I actually had a conference where people came and saw me present. But now this is recorded for posterity, so great. And if you don't have any questions, I'm gonna call it a day for the session. If you have any other questions, let us know. You can always reach the panelists via their email. And thank you so much to all the panelists and all the attendees. This was great. Serena?
Yes. Hi.
I am going to shut down and come back, okay? Because it gets recorded each time. Give me 2 minutes.
No worries. Thank you very much.